The dust kicked up by the stranger's arrival settled slowly in the afternoon heat, but Jake Morrison kept polishing the same glass he'd been working on for the past 10 minutes. Through the batwing doors of the Dusty Spur Saloon, he watched something that shouldn't exist anywhere near the frontier town of Dead Rock, Arizona. The creature stood 8 feet tall, its scales shimmering between deep purple and midnight black in the harsh desert sun, wings folded against its back like a gentleman's coat, and intelligent golden eyes surveyed the ramshackle buildings with obvious disdain. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of ancient authority. "I seek the one called Morrison," the dragon announced to the handful of cowboys who had scattered like tumbleweeds at its arrival. "The keeper of spirits in this establishment." Jake set down the glass with deliberate calm. In his 43 years of life, he'd seen many strange things, though none quite like this. The other patrons of his saloon, Old Pete, the Jameson brothers, and Sarah from the general store, had pressed themselves against the far wall, their faces pale with terror. "That'd be me," Jake called out, stepping into the doorway. His voice carried no fear, only the measured tone of a man who'd dealt with difficult customers before. "Though I've got to say you're a bit different from my usual clientele." The dragon's head turned toward him with fluid grace, those golden eyes narrowing as they took in Jake's appearance. Average height, weathered hands, graying brown hair, and clothes that had seen better days. Nothing remarkable about him at all, which was exactly how Jake preferred it. "You are mortal," the dragon said, as if the word left a bad taste in its mouth. "I was told I would find someone of consequence here." Jake stepped fully outside, his boots creating small puffs of dust with each step. The sun beat down mercilessly, but he seemed unbothered by it, unlike the dragon, who shifted uncomfortably in the heat. "Consequence is relative," Jake replied, stopping about 10 feet from the massive creature. "What brings you to Dead Rock? We don't get many visitors, especially ones who can fly." The dragon's nostrils flared, and Jake caught a whiff of something like sulfur mixed with ozone. "I am Zephyrian the Destroyer, herald of the cosmic throne, bringer of the final judgment. I have traveled across 7 star systems to deliver a message of utmost importance." "That's quite a mouthful of titles," Jake observed, pulling a toothpick from his vest pocket and placing it between his teeth. "Your folks sure didn't believe in keeping things simple, did they?" Several of the cowboys inside the saloon gasped at Jake's casual disrespect, but the bartender seemed entirely unfazed by the creature's imposing presence. If anything, he looked mildly amused. Zephyrian's scales rippled with what might have been irritation. "You dare mock me, mortal? I have reduced entire planets to ash for lesser insults." "I'm sure you have," Jake agreed pleasantly. "But you're not here to reduce anything to ash, are you? You said you had a message. Messages usually don't require planet destroying in my experience." The dragon studied him more carefully now, its head tilting slightly to one side. There was something about this human that didn't quite fit. Most mortals either cowered in terror or charged forward with suicidal bravery when faced with a being of Zephyrian's obvious power. This one just stood there, relaxed and conversational, as if discussing the weather. "The message concerns the lost prince," Zephyrian said finally, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "The rightful heir to the throne of Andromeda's Prime has been missing for over 4 decades. The Galactic Council grows impatient and war threatens to consume a dozen systems." Jake's expression didn't change, but his fingers drummed once against his leg, a tiny movement that spoke of sudden tension. "That sounds like a problem for folks with more resources than a frontier bartender. What's it got to do with me?" "Intelligence suggests the prince may have taken refuge on this backward planet," Zephyrian continued, his eyes scanning the primitive buildings around them. "He would be approximately your age, possibly using primitive technology to mask his true nature." "A lot of folks around my age in these parts," Jake said. "Growing old ain't exactly uncommon." The dragon stepped closer, its massive claws leaving deep gouges in the hard-packed earth. "The prince was trained from birth in the ancient arts. He would be impossibly skilled in combat, unusually intelligent and capable of blending in anywhere, but there would be signs, moments when his true nature showed through." Jake chewed thoughtfully on his toothpick. Around them, the town had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of the day, children playing, horses nickering, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, had stopped. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. "Signs like what?" Jake asked. "Unusual luck. Problems that solve themselves around him. an ability to calm violent situations with just a word or look. People would trust him instinctively even if they couldn't say why. Zephyrian's voice grew more intense, and he would never age as quickly as normal humans. A smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth. You just described half the bartenders west of the Mississippi. We're a charming lot. This is no jest, mortal. Zephyrian's voice boomed across the desert, causing several windows to rattle. The fate of billions hangs in the balance. If the prince is not found and returned to claim his throne, the Zephyrian Empire will have no choice but to assume control of the disputed territories. War will follow and entire civilizations will burn. Jake removed the toothpick from his mouth and flicked it away. For just a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something ancient and knowing that sat strangely in his weathered face. Well, he said quietly, I reckon that would be a terrible shame. The dragon leaned forward, sensing something in the human's tone that hadn't been there before. You know something. I know lots of things, Jake replied. I know that dragons don't usually travel 7-star systems to deliver messages personally. I know that a creature of your obvious power wouldn't waste time talking to a simple bartender, unless there was more to the story. And I know that sometimes the most important truths are hiding in the most unlikely places. Zephyrian's eyes narrowed to golden slits. Speak plainly, human. What do you know of the lost prince? Jake walked slowly back toward the saloon, gesturing for Zephyrian to follow. Why don't you come inside? The sun's getting to you and I've got some things that might interest you. The dragon hesitated. I am not affected by mere stellar radiation. Course not, Jake agreed, though he'd noticed the way Zephyrian's scales had begun to dull and how the creature kept shifting, to stay in what little shade was available. But my customers are getting nervous and nervous folks do stupid things. Inside we can talk without worrying about someone taking a potshot at you with a rifle. As if summoned by his words, Jake spotted movement in the window of the building across the street. Sheriff Dalton had positioned himself with his buffalo gun, though what he thought that would accomplish against a dragon was anyone's guess. Zephyrian followed Jake's gaze and snorted, a small puff of flame escaping his nostrils. Your local peacekeepers are optimistic. They're protective, Jake corrected, pushing through the batwing doors. These people have built something good here, and they don't want to lose it. The saloon's interior was dim and cool compared to the blazing desert outside. Jake's customers had managed to clear out through the back door, leaving only old Pete, who sat nursing a whiskey with hands that shook slightly. The old-timer had seen action in the war and wasn't easily spooked, but dragons apparently fell outside his comfort zone. Pete, you might want to take that drink upstairs, Jake suggested gently. The old man nodded gratefully and hobbled toward the staircase, pausing only to mutter, You sure know how to pick your customers? Jake. Once they were alone, Zephyrian folded his wings more tightly and looked around the modest establishment. This is where you choose to spend your time. Serving fermented grain to primitive beings? Jake moved behind the bar and began wiping down glasses, a habit that helped him think. There's something to be said for honest work. People come in tired, thirsty, maybe a little lonely. I give them a drink, a friendly word, sometimes a place to sleep off their troubles. They leave feeling a little better than when they arrived. How wonderfully. Pedestrian, Zephyrian said, though his tone suggested he found it more puzzling than dismissive. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about people when they think you're nobody important. Jake held up a glass to the light, checking for spots. Take you, for instance. You've been traveling for months, haven't you? This isn't your first stop on Earth. The dragon's golden eyes sharpened. How could you possibly know that? Jake set down the glass and picked up another. Your scales are worn smooth in places where armor or a harness would rub. That takes time. Your accent has traces of at least 3 different galactic dialects, which suggests you've been asking questions in multiple star systems. And you're tired, really tired, not just from the heat, the kind of tired that comes from too many dead ends and false leads. Zephyrian was quiet for a long moment, studying the seemingly ordinary human with new interest. You are remarkably observant for a, what did you call it, keeper of spirits? Bartender, Jake supplied. And observation is part of the job. You learn to read people, figure out what they need before they ask for it. Sometimes they need a drink, sometimes they need to talk, sometimes they just need someone to listen. And what do you think I need? Jake's movement stilled for just a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. You need to find someone who's been lost for a very long time. Someone who's been hiding so long he's almost forgotten who he really is. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Zephyrian leaned forward, his massive bulk making the floorboards creak. Go on. Jake resumed his glass polishing, but there was something different about his posture now. Straighter, more controlled. The thing about hiding is that after a while the mask becomes comfortable. You start to believe your own story. You convince yourself that the simple life is better, that the responsibilities you left behind don't matter anymore. But they do matter, Zephyrian said quietly. Yes, Jake agreed. They always matter. The question is whether the person wearing the mask is ready to take it off, and how would one make that determination? Jake smiled, and for a brief moment there was something regal in his expression, a glimpse of nobility that sat strangely on his weathered features. You start by asking the right questions. Not where is the prince, but why did he leave in the first place? Zephyrian's claws clicked against the wooden floor as he shifted position. The official records indicate he disappeared during a diplomatic mission to the Outer Rim. Pirates were blamed. Official records often leave out the most important parts, Jake observed. What do the unofficial records say? That he left voluntarily. That he discovered something about the Galactic Council that made him question everything he'd been taught. The dragon's voice grew hesitant. That he believed the throne itself might be corrupt. Jake nodded slowly. That would be a heavy burden for a young man to carry, especially one raised to believe in duty above all else. You speak as if you knew him. I know the type, Jake said carefully. Young, idealistic, trained from birth to put the needs of others before his own. When someone like that discovers the system they've devoted their life to might be fundamentally flawed, well, it can break a person, or make them run away, Zephyrian added. Running away isn't always cowardice, Jake said, his voice gaining strength. Sometimes it's the only way to survive long enough to figure out the truth. Sometimes the best thing a prince can do for his people is refuse to be their prince. The dragon studied him intently. That sounds dangerously close to treason. Jake's laugh was short and bitter. Treason assumes loyalty to something worth being loyal to. What if the entire system is built on lies? What if the throne everyone wants this prince to claim is nothing more than a pretty chair in a palace of corruption? Then the prince would have a responsibility to change things, not run from them. Would he? Jake stopped polishing and looked directly at Zephyrian. What if changing the system would mean becoming part of it? What if the only way to fix things is to destroy them completely? And he's not ready for that kind of responsibility. Are you speaking hypothetically, Morrison? The dragon's voice carried a new edge. Or do you know more about Prince Kael'than's thoughts than you've admitted? The glass in Jake's hand paused mid-wipe. It was a tiny hesitation, lasting perhaps half a second, but Zephyrian caught it. That's an interesting name, Jake said quietly. I haven't heard it in a long time. Because you've been hiding from it. Jake set down the glass and placed both hands flat on the bar. When he looked up, his eyes held depths that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the small saloon. Hiding, he said slowly, or waiting for the right moment to remember who I really am. Zephyrian's entire posture changed. The casual conversation was over, replaced by the focused attention of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. You are him. You are Prince Kael'than of Andromeda's Prime. Jake, or Kael'than, straightened slowly. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared, his chin lifted, and suddenly, the humble bartender seemed to command the entire room. That name belonged to someone who believed in fairy tales. Fairy tales? Justice. Honor. The idea that those in power actually care about the people they rule. His voice carried decades of accumulated pain and disillusionment. I spent my youth training to inherit a throne I thought represented hope for billions of beings across the galaxy. Do you know what I found when I finally looked behind the curtain? Zephyrian remained silent, sensing the importance of the moment. Slavery dressed up as trade agreements. Genocide called population management. Entire species bred like cattle to feed the appetites of the core worlds. Kael'than moved from behind the bar, and his stride carried an unconscious authority that 40 years of hiding couldn't completely erase. The Galactic Council doesn't govern, Zephyrian. It harvests. These are serious accusations. These are facts. The words carried enough force to rattle the bottles on the shelf. I saw the breeding facilities on Kepler 7. I witnessed the resource extraction operations in the Vega system. I stood in the throne room while my own father signed orders that condemned millions to lives of servitude. And when I objected, I was told it was necessary for the greater good. Zephyrian's wings rustled nervously. The report said you disappeared during a diplomatic mission. I ran, Kelthan admitted without shame. After I accessed the classified archives and learned the truth about everything, the wars, the famines, the carefully orchestrated accidents that removed inconvenient leaders, I took a ship and flew as far from civilized space as I could get. To Earth. To nowhere, Kelthan corrected. I chose a planet so primitive and isolated that no one would ever think to look for me here. A place where I could be nobody, where I could spend my days doing something simple and honest without the weight of an empire on my shoulders. The dragon studied him carefully. Yet you did not simply disappear. You built a life here. These humans, they matter to you. Kelthan glanced toward the window where he could see Sheriff Dalton still positioned with his rifle, ready to defend his town against a threat he couldn't possibly understand. At first I just wanted to hide. I used my training to blend in, learned their languages and customs, became someone forgettable. But, a smile touched the former prince's lips. But humans are extraordinary in ways the Galactic Council never understood. They're not as technologically advanced, true, but they have something we lost somewhere along the way to building our great civilization, which is hope. Kelthan walked to the window and looked out at the dusty street where children played despite the heat, where neighbors helped each other without expectation of reward, where people faced hardship with stubborn determination. These people don't have faster-than-light travel or energy weapons or life extension technology. What they have is infinitely more valuable. A backward planet full of primitive beings who will be dead in a few decades, Zephyrian said dismissively. The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in an instant. When Kelthan turned back to face the dragon, his eyes blazed with an inner fire that spoke of barely controlled power. Careful, Harold. You're a guest in my establishment, in my town, on my adopted world. I've spent 40 years learning to appreciate what these primitive beings have accomplished, and I won't hear them dismissed by someone who serves the very corruption I escaped. Zephyrian took an involuntary step backward, suddenly remembering that the man before him had been trained from birth in arts that could level mountains. I meant no offense. Of course you did. Kelthan's anger faded as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by something sadder and more complex. You've been raised in the same system I was. You see efficiency instead of beauty, resources instead of lives, problems instead of possibilities. It's not your fault, it's what we were all taught. The galaxy burns while you play at being human, Zephyrian said, though his tone was less accusatory than before. Surely your responsibility to your people outweighs your personal comfort. My people? Kelthan laughed, but there was no humor in it. Which people? The billions suffering under council rule? The noble families who profit from their misery? The military commanders who enforce orders they know are wrong? Everyone claims to speak for my people, but no one asks what they actually want. They want strong leadership. They want order. They want freedom, Kelthan countered. They want the right to make their own choices, to succeed or fail based on their own efforts, to raise their children without fear of conscription or redistribution. They want what these humans have, the chance to build something meaningful with their own hands. Zephyrian's claws scraped against the floor as he paced. You would abandon your birthright for sentiment? I would abandon a poisoned throne for truth. Kelthan moved back behind the bar, but his posture remained regal despite the humble surroundings. Do you know what I've learned in 40 years of running a saloon? I've learned that power means nothing without trust, that leadership is service, not dominion, and that the measure of a ruler is not how much he can take from his people, but how much he can give them. Philosophy, Zephyrian spat. While you philosophize, the border systems prepare for war. The Zephyrian Empire masses its fleets. Without the stabilizing presence of the Andromeda's prince, the Council's authority crumbles and chaos follows. Good, Kelthan said quietly. Let it crumble. Let the artificial order built on suffering collapse. Sometimes you have to burn down a diseased tree before anything healthy can grow in its place. You would see billions die for your principles. I would see billions live free instead of dying as slaves. The former prince's voice carried absolute conviction. And I would make sure that whatever rises from the ashes is built on something better than fear and exploitation. Zephyrian stopped pacing and fixed him with a steady stare. You speak as though you have a plan. Kelthan smiled. And for the first time since entering the saloon, Zephyrian caught a glimpse of the brilliant strategist who had once been heir to the most powerful throne in the galaxy. "I've had 40 years to think about it," Kelton said. 40 years to study how real civilizations work, how people organize themselves when they're free to choose their own path. "Did you think I was just hiding, Harold? I've been learning. And now?" "Now?" Kelton's eyes gleamed with possibility and determination. "Now it's time to put that education to use." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Kelton watched Sheriff Dalton ride hard toward the saloon, his face grim with urgency. Behind him, dust clouds on the horizon suggested more riders, many more. "Expecting company?" Zephyrian asked, following his gaze. "Not the kind we want," Kelton muttered, moving to the window. His enhanced vision picked out details that would have been invisible to human eyes. The riders wore black uniforms with silver insignia, and their weapons were decidedly not of terrestrial origin. Sheriff Dalton burst through the saloon doors, his buffalo gun forgotten in favor of the smaller pistol at his hip. "Jake, we've got trouble coming in fast. Strange men in black, riding horses but carrying weapons like nothing I've ever seen. They're asking about you specifically." Zephyrian's head snapped toward Kelton. "Council enforcers. Someone tracked me here. How many?" Kelton asked, his voice deadly calm. 20, maybe 25, Dalton replied. "They'll be here in 10 minutes, maybe less." Kelton closed his eyes and accessed senses he'd kept dormant for decades. Energy signatures blazed against his consciousness like miniature suns. Advanced weapons, shield generators, even a few personal cloaking devices. These weren't just enforcers. They were elite units. "Sheriff, I need you to evacuate the town. Get everyone to the caves in Miller's Canyon. Don't argue, just do it." Dalton's weathered face showed confusion but not hesitation. In 40 years, Jake Morrison had never steered him wrong. "What about you?" "I'll handle our visitors." Kelton turned to Zephyrian, and the dragon saw something in his eyes that made ancient instincts whisper warnings. "I assume you didn't come here alone?" "My ship is cloaked in orbit," Zephyrian admitted. "But these enforcers, if they found you, they found me too. My presence here was supposed to be secret." "Secret from whom?" The dragon's silence was answer enough. Kelton felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "You weren't sent by the Galactic Council, were you? You're working for someone else." "The resistance movement has grown larger than you might imagine," Zephyrian said carefully. "There are those within the Empire who remember what you stood for, who believe the old ways can be restored, or who want to use my name to legitimize their own grab for power." Kelton moved to a seemingly ordinary cabinet and opened it, revealing weapons and equipment that definitely didn't belong in an Old West saloon. "The question is, which are you?" Sheriff Dalton gaped at the advanced technology. "Jake, what in the—" "Not now, Sheriff. Please just get the people to safety." Dalton nodded reluctantly and headed for the door, pausing only to say, "Whatever trouble you're in, son, this town stands with you." After the sheriff left, Kelton began arming himself with practiced efficiency. A personal shield generator went on his belt, followed by weapons that hummed with contained energy. "Who sent you, Harold? And don't waste my time with half-truths. Those enforcers out there are equipped to level this entire town looking for me." "Admiral Vexhai of the Outer Rim Coalition," Zephyrian admitted. "She believes the time has come to move against the Council directly. But she needs a symbol, someone the people will follow. She needs a puppet. She needs the rightful heir to unite the opposition." Zephyrian's voice grew urgent as the sound of approaching riders grew louder. "The Council grows more brutal by the day. 3 more systems have been stripped of resources this year alone. Entire populations relocated to productivity centers that are nothing more than prison camps." Kelton paused in his preparations. "Which systems?" "Altair Secundus. The Vega colonies, New Thessaly." Pain flashed across the former prince's features. "I know those places. Good people, trying to build something decent for themselves." He finished checking his weapons and looked directly at Zephyrian. "What does Admiral Vexhai propose?" "Open rebellion. A coordinated strike against Council strongholds across the galaxy. But she needs legitimacy, a royal bloodline to rally behind. And if I refuse?" Zephyrian gestured toward the approaching dust cloud. "The Council has decided you're too dangerous to leave alive. Those enforcers aren't here to arrest you, Prince. They're here to eliminate a threat to the established order." The riders were close enough now that Kael'thas could hear their voices calling commands to each other. Through the window, he saw townsfolk hurrying toward the desert with whatever belongings they could carry. Sheriff Dalton was doing his job, getting innocent people out of harm's way. 40 years, Kael'thas said quietly. 40 years of peace, of simple pleasures, of being nobody important. Did you know I learned to play the harmonica? I can brew beer that would make a Rigelian weep with joy. I've read every book in this town 3 times over. Was it worth it? Zephyrian asked. Knowing what was happening out there while you played at being human? Kael'thas smiled, and there was something fierce and joyful in his expression. Every minute. Because it taught me something the Council never understood. What we're actually fighting for. Not power or territory or resources, but the right to live freely, to make choices, to build something meaningful with your own hands. The first of the black-clad riders appeared at the end of the main street. Their leader raised his hand and the others spread out in a practice formation that spoke of military training and lethal intent. So what do we do? Zephyrian asked. Kael'thas walked to the center of the saloon and stood perfectly still for a moment, drawing on training that had been burned into his bones before he could walk. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer Jake Morrison, humble bartender. He was Prince Kael'thas of Andromeda's Prime, heir to a throne he'd never wanted and power he'd spent decades trying to forget. We remind them why the old bloodlines were feared, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself tremble. We show them that a prince who's learned to value freedom is far more dangerous than one who simply inherited a crown. The enforcers dismounted and began advancing on the saloon with weapons drawn. Their leader, a tall woman with the cold eyes of someone who'd killed too many times to count, called out in a voice amplified by technology. Prince Kael'thas of Andromeda's Prime, by order of the Galactic Council, you are condemned as a traitor to the realm. Surrender now and your death will be swift. Kael'thas stepped through the batwing doors and into the street. The desert sun caught the weapons at his belt and the shield shimmering around his body. But more than that, it illuminated something in his bearing that spoke of royalty reclaimed. I am Prince Kael'thas, he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. And you are trespassing on my world. The enforcer leader smiled coldly. Your world? This backward planet belongs to no one of consequence. That, said the prince who'd learned the value of simple things, is where you're wrong. The enforcer leader raised her weapon, a sleek pulse rifle that could punch through reinforced battle armor. Last chance, traitor prince. Surrender or she never finished the sentence. Kael'thas moved with inhuman speed, closing the 50-foot distance between them in the time it took her to blink. His hand closed around the barrel of her weapon, and with a casual twist, he crushed the advanced metal like paper. I've learned something about fighting in my years here, he said conversationally, as the other enforcers scrambled to react. These people taught me that violence should always be the last resort, but when it becomes necessary, you don't hold anything back. The remaining enforcers opened fire simultaneously. Energy bolts that could have leveled buildings struck Kael'thas' personal shields and scattered harmlessly into the desert air. He stood unmoved in the center of their fire, protected by technology that was centuries ahead of anything they carried. Impossible, one of the enforcers gasped. No personal shield can handle that kind of focused fire. You're right, Kael'thas agreed. A personal shield can't. He gestured, and the air around him shimmered. But royal battle shield generators are another matter entirely. From the sky above, Zephyrian descended like a living nightmare, his massive form blotting out the sun. The dragon's roar shattered windows for 3 blocks in every direction, and several of the enforcers' horses bolted in terror. But the soldiers themselves held their ground. These were elite troops, trained to face threats that would send regular forces fleeing. Surrender now, Zephyrian boomed, and you may yet live to see another star rise. The enforcer leader, whose nameplate read Commander Thale, snarled and pulled out a device that looked like a small silver sphere. Orbital bombardment beacon. One signal from this and your precious little town becomes a crater. Kael'thas stopped advancing. Around them, the street was eerily quiet except for the nervous stamping of the remaining horses and the hum of charged weapons. You would destroy an entire settlement of innocents to kill one man? He asked. I would do whatever is necessary to complete my mission, Thale replied coldly. The council has decreed that Prince Kael'thas must die, and I will not return without proof of your death. Then you have a problem, Kael'thas said quietly. Because I won't let you harm these people, and I won't run away again. He closed his eyes and reached out with senses that had been trained by masters who remembered when the galaxy was young. The orbital beacon was a simple device, really. Just a transmitter that would send a coded signal to the Council dreadnought, hidden behind Earth's moon. But like all technology, it was vulnerable to someone who understood its fundamental principles. When Kelthan opened his eyes, they blazed with an inner light that spoke of power drawn from the deepest wells of ancient knowledge. He raised his hand, and every piece of advanced technology within 100 yards began to malfunction. Weapons sparked and died. Shield generators flickered out. Even the Enforcer's enhanced armor systems failed, leaving them in nothing more than expensive clothing. How? Thale whispered, staring at her dead beacon. Electromagnetic pulse focused and controlled, Kelthan explained, walking slowly toward her. A trick I learned from human engineers, actually. They're quite resourceful when they put their minds to it. The Enforcers drew primitive backup weapons, steel knives and projectile pistols that wouldn't be affected by electromagnetic interference. It was a smart tactical decision, but it wouldn't help them against an opponent who had been trained in combat before some of their worlds had developed agriculture. Stand down, Kelthan ordered, his voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. I don't want to kill you. You're soldiers following orders, and that's honorable in its way. But I won't let you threaten innocent people. We have our duty, Thale said, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Duty to whom? Kelthan asked. To a council that treats entire species like livestock? To a system that measures success by how much suffering it can cause? Look around you, Commander. This is what freedom looks like, messy, imperfect, but real. One of the younger Enforcers lowered his weapon slightly. Sir, maybe we should hold your position, Thale snapped. The prince is using psychological warfare. He's trying to confuse you. No, Kelthan said sadly. I'm trying to show you the truth, but I understand if you can't see it. The conditioning runs deep, and questioning everything you've been taught is the hardest thing anyone can do. He moved again, but this time with deliberate slowness, giving them every opportunity to see him coming. The first Enforcer to attack him came in fast and low with a vibroblade, a move that would have gutted most opponents. Kelthan simply wasn't there when the blade arrived. He reappeared behind the soldier and placed a precise touch at the base of his skull. The Enforcer dropped unconscious but unharmed. Pressure point technique, he explained to the remaining soldiers. He'll wake up in a few hours with nothing worse than a headache. The next three came at him together, coordinating their attacks with professional skill. Kelthan flowed between them like water, his movements economical and precise. Each touch sent another soldier into peaceful unconsciousness. No broken bones, no permanent damage, just carefully applied knowledge that put them to sleep. Within minutes, only Commander Thale remained standing, her hand trembling slightly as she pointed her projectile pistol at his chest. You're showing mercy, she said, as if the concept was foreign to her. I'm showing humanity, Kelthan corrected. Something I learned from the people you would have killed today. They taught me that strength isn't about how much damage you can cause, it's about how much damage you can prevent. Thale's weapon wavered. But you're royal blood. You were trained to be a weapon of the state. I was trained to be a protector of the people, Kelthan said gently. The council forgot that distinction somewhere along the way, but I haven't. From the direction of the town, voices called out. Sheriff Dalton was returning with a group of armed townspeople. Having seen the fight from a distance, they came prepared to defend their home and their friend, regardless of the odds against them. You see? Kelthan asked Thale. These people don't even know who I really am, but they're willing to risk their lives for me. Not because of my bloodline or my title, but because I've tried to be worthy of their trust. That's the kind of loyalty a real leader earns. Thale stared at the approaching townspeople, then at her unconscious soldiers, then at the prince who could have killed them all but chose not to. Slowly she lowered her weapon. What happens now? She asked. Kelthan smiled, and for a moment, she caught a glimpse of the leader he might have been if he'd stayed on Andromeda's Prime. Now, he said, we talk about what kind of galaxy we really want to live in. Zephyrian landed nearby, his massive form no longer threatening but protective. The people approached, Prince. Will you tell them the truth? Kelthan looked at Sheriff Dalton and the others coming to help a man they knew only as Jake Morrison, humble bartender and friend. Men and women ready to fight impossible odds for someone who had earned their respect through 40 years of simple decency. Yes, he said, I think it's time they knew exactly who they've been sharing their town with. Sheriff Dalton arrived with 20 armed townspeople, their faces set with the grim determination of folks defending their home. He pulled up short when he saw the unconscious enforcers scattered around the street, and Kylthan standing calmly in the center of it all, completely unharmed. Well, I'll be damned, Dalton muttered, holstering his pistol. Jake, you want to explain how one bartender took down 20 trained soldiers? Kylthan looked around at the faces of people who had been his friends and neighbors for 4 decades. Sarah from the general store, the Jameson brothers, Doc Hendricks, old Pete who was still clutching his whiskey bottle, and dozens of others who had come running when they heard trouble. My name isn't Jake Morrison, he said simply. It's Kylthan, and I'm what you might call foreign royalty. Foreign how? Asked Mary Chen, the schoolteacher, eyeing Zephyrian nervously. About as foreign as it gets, Kylthan admitted. I'm from a place so far away that your fastest ships couldn't reach it in 1,000 lifetimes. I came here running from responsibilities I thought I couldn't handle, and I've been hiding among you ever since. The crowd exchanged uncertain glances. Doc Hendricks, who had seen Jake treat injuries that should have taken weeks to heal and noticed he never seemed to age quite right, stepped forward. Foreign royalty, you say? That explains a few things, but it doesn't explain why you stayed. Kylthan smiled at the elderly doctor who had become one of his closest friends. At first I stayed because this was a good place to hide. But after a while I stayed because this became home. You people taught me something I'd never learned in all my years of royal education, what it means to build something worthwhile. And these soldiers? Sheriff Dalton gestured to the unconscious enforcers. They came to kill me because I refused to return to a system that treats people like property. The government I was born to inherit is corrupt beyond redemption, and they see me as a threat to their authority. Sarah Chen stepped closer, her weathered face thoughtful. You're talking about a revolution, aren't you? That's what this is really about. I'm talking about freedom, Kylthan replied. The same kind of freedom you've built here in Deadrock. The right to make your own choices, to succeed or fail on your own merits, to raise your children without fear of some distant authority deciding their fate. Commander Thele, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. You make it sound simple, but the galaxy isn't a frontier town. There are billions of beings who need order, structure, protection from chaos. There are billions of beings who need the chance to create their own order. Kylthan countered. Look around you, Commander. These people don't have a massive government telling them how to live, but they're not in chaos. They've built schools, businesses, families. They take care of their sick and protect their weak because it's the right thing to do, not because someone ordered them to. Old Pete hobbled forward, studying Kylthan with rheumy but sharp eyes. So you're saying you're some kind of space prince and you've been pretending to be a bartender for 40 years? That's about the size of it, Pete. Pete took a long drink from his bottle and nodded solemnly. Well, you make a hell of a whiskey for a prince. That's got to count for something. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. Trust Pete to find the practical angle. Doc Hendricks cleared his throat. The question is, what happens now? Will there be more soldiers? Zephyrian answered before Kylthan could speak. Many more. The council has declared him an enemy of the state. They will not stop sending forces until he is dead or captured. Then they'll have to go through us, Sheriff Dalton said firmly. Jake, Kylthan, whatever your name is, you've been a good neighbor and friend. This town doesn't abandon its own. You don't understand, Commander Thale protested. The next force won't be 20 enforcers with small arms. It will be a full military strike force with orbital support. They'll level this entire settlement to get to him. Then we'd better make sure he's not here when they arrive, Mary Chen said pragmatically. Or we figure out how to make them think twice about attacking. Kylthan felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of leadership he'd been running from for 40 years. But this time it felt different. Instead of the crushing obligation to serve a corrupt system, this felt like responsibility freely chosen. There is another option, he said slowly. Admiral Vexhai and the Outer Rim Coalition are organizing resistance against the Council. They want me to return and lead a rebellion. And, Dalton prompted, and I've been thinking that maybe it's time to stop running. Kylthan looked around at the faces of his adopted family. But I won't do it the old way. No more thrones built on the backs of the suffering. No more royal bloodlines deciding the fate of billions. If I'm going to fight, it's going to be for something better. Like what? Sarah asked. Like this. He gestured to encompass the town around them. A galaxy where every world gets to decide for itself how to live. Where people cooperate because they choose to, not because they're forced to. Where the strong protect the weak not out of duty but out of love. Zephyrian's massive head tilted thoughtfully. You speak of democracy, Prince. The Council has always claimed such systems lead to chaos and inefficiency. The Council fears democracy because it would put them out of business, Kael'thas replied. Hard to maintain absolute power when people get to vote on whether they want you in charge. Commander Thale stared at him in amazement. You're talking about dismantling the entire galactic order, ending thousands of years of imperial rule. The consequences would be unknown, Kael'thas admitted. Frightening. Difficult. But look at what those thousands of years of imperial rule have given us. Slavery disguised as trade, genocide called progress, and entire species living in fear of their own governments. Maybe it's time to try something different. Doc Hendricks chuckled. You know, in 40 years of knowing you, I never once saw you back down from doing what was right even when it was hard. I don't see why that should change now. The doctor's right, Sheriff Dalton agreed. You've got a good heart and a strong arm. If you think there's a better way to do things, then maybe folks ought to listen. Kael'thas felt something he hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Not the naive optimism of his youth, but the seasoned confidence of someone who had learned what was truly worth fighting for. Zephyrian, he said, turning to the dragon. Contact Admiral Vexai. Tell her I'll meet with the coalition, but on my terms. I won't be a figurehead for someone else's revolution. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And what does right mean? The dragon asked. Kael'thas smiled. And his expression held the wisdom of 40 years spent learning from the best teachers in the galaxy. Ordinary people who had built extraordinary lives through simple decency and mutual respect. It means we're going to show the galaxy what freedom actually looks like. 3 days later, Kael'thas stood in the main cargo bay of Zephyrian's ship, watching Earth shrink to a blue marble in the viewport. The vessel was impressive by galactic standards, sleek, fast, and armed with enough firepower to level a small moon. But after 40 years in Deadrock, it felt sterile and cold. Second thoughts? Zephyrian asked, noting his expression. No, Kael'thas replied, though his voice carried a note of sadness. Just saying goodbye. Behind them, Commander Thale and her surviving enforcers sat in the ship's common area, no longer prisoners but not quite allies either. They had volunteered to come along after witnessing something unprecedented, a leader who kept his word and treated enemies with mercy. I still don't understand, Thale said for the 10th time. You could have executed us for treason. By council law, you had every right. Council law, Kael'thas said, turning from the viewport. There's the problem right there. Laws should serve justice, not the other way around. What would executing you have accomplished besides adding more violence to an already bloody situation? It would have sent a message about the price of opposing you. And what message did mercy send? Thale was quiet for a long moment. That you're nothing like what we were told to expect. Exactly. Kael'thas moved to the ship's communication console and activated the long-range transmitter. Zephyrian, patch me through to Admiral Vexai. The screen flickered to life, revealing a Regellian woman whose blue skin was marked with the ritual scars of a military commander. Her forearms moved independently as she worked at multiple control interfaces, and her large, dark eyes fixed on Kael'thas with undisguised curiosity. Prince Kael'thas, she said, her voice carrying the musical tones of her species. I had begun to think you were a myth. I'm real enough, he replied, though I'm not the same person who disappeared 40 years ago. We need to talk, Admiral, but not over an open channel. Where can we meet? The Coalition has established a base in the Kepler system. We control 3 worlds there, free from Council interference. I can have a ship meet you at the edge of the system. That won't be necessary. This vessel is fast enough to reach Kepler in 6 days. But Admiral, I want something understood from the beginning. I'm not coming to take orders or to be anyone's puppet ruler. I'm coming to propose a different way of doing things. Vexai's expression grew wary. What kind of different way? The kind where people get to choose their own leaders instead of inheriting them. The kind where decisions are made by consensus rather than decree. The kind where power flows up from the people instead of down from a throne. You're talking about abandoning monarchy entirely, the Admiral said, her voice barely concealing her shock. I'm talking about building something better, something worth fighting for instead of just fighting against. The transmission ended, and Zephyrian turned to study his passenger. You realize what you're proposing will be seen as radical by both sides. The Council will consider it anarchistic madness, and the Coalition expected a traditional prince to rally behind. Then they'll both have to adapt, Kelton said firmly. I spent 4 decades learning from people who built a functioning society without kings or emperors. It can be done on a larger scale. Over the next 6 days, as they traveled through the vast emptiness between stars, Kelton shared his vision with anyone willing to listen. Commander Thale and her soldiers found themselves drawn into discussions about governance and justice that challenged everything they'd been taught. Even Zephyrian, ancient and set in his ways, began to see the appeal of systems based on consent rather than conquest. When they finally arrived at Kepler 7, Kelton was amazed by what the Coalition had accomplished. 3 entire worlds had declared independence from the Council, and they were thriving. Cities hummed with activity. Orbital stations buzzed with merchant traffic, and everywhere he looked, he saw people working together by choice rather than compulsion. Admiral Vexhai met them at the primary space station with a delegation of Coalition leaders representing dozens of species. Their faces showed everything from hope to skepticism to barely concealed ambition. Prince Kelton, Vexhai said formally, welcome to Free Kepler. We have much to discuss. The meeting took place in a chamber designed to accommodate the Coalition's diverse membership. Aquatic beings floated in suspension tanks while others required specialized atmospheric support. It was a reminder of just how vast and varied the galaxy truly was. Before we begin, Kelton said, addressing the assembled leaders, I want to make something clear. I didn't come here to claim a throne or to lead a traditional rebellion. I came here to propose that we build something the galaxy has never seen, a truly representative government. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Some leaders leaned forward with interest, others looked skeptical, and a few appeared downright hostile to the idea. With respect, Prince, said General Korvax, a hulking reptilian whose species had been enslaved by the Council for centuries, we need strong leadership. Democracy is a luxury for peaceful times. Democracy is a necessity for all times, Kelton countered. Strong leadership without accountability becomes tyranny, no matter how well-intentioned. I've seen what happens when good people are given absolute power. They inevitably stop being good people. And if the Council attacks while we're debating and voting? Asked Chancellor Mirren, a graceful humanoid whose world had been strip-mined by Council corporations. Then we defend ourselves, Kelton said simply. But we do it as free beings fighting for the right to remain free, not as subjects following orders from another unelected ruler. Admiral Vexhai studied him carefully. You've given this considerable thought. 40 years of it, he confirmed. I lived among a people who proved that free societies can be strong, prosperous, and just. They taught me that the best leaders are servants, not masters. And you believe this can work on a galactic scale? General Korvax asked skeptically. I believe it's the only thing that can work long-term, Kelton replied. Every empire in galactic history has eventually collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Every kingdom has fallen to either external enemies or internal revolt. But democracy, messy, inefficient, sometimes frustrating democracy, endures because it adapts. The debate continued for hours, with passionate arguments on all sides. But gradually Kelton began to see minds changing. These were leaders who had suffered under the Council's rule, who had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do. The idea of building something better, something that couldn't become the very thing they were fighting against, began to take hold. Finally, Admiral Vexhai called for a recess. As the other leaders filed out to consider what they'd heard, she approached Kelton privately. You realize what you're asking them to do? She said quietly. You're asking them to give up the possibility of ruling in favor of the certainty of serving. I'm asking them to choose between being kings of ashes or citizens of something magnificent, he replied. The choice they make will determine whether we're just another revolution or the beginning of something truly revolutionary. Through the station's viewports, Kelton could see the 3 worlds of Free Kepler spinning in their orbits, home to billions of beings who had tasted freedom and would never willingly give it up again. Somewhere in the distance, council fleets gathered for what would surely be a devastating counterattack. The galaxy stood at a crossroads, and the decisions made in the next few days would echo across space and time for generations to come. But for the first time in 40 years, Prince Kael'thas felt truly hopeful. He had learned from the best teachers in the universe, ordinary people doing extraordinary things through simple decency and mutual respect. Now it was time to share those lessons with the galaxy. The revolution would not be won by force of arms alone, but by the power of an idea whose time had finally come, that beings everywhere deserve the right to choose their own destiny. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a prince could do was teach people they didn't need princes at all.